All right, so on our backside of notes here is a little bit of an introduction and a review of our unit circle that we've talked about up to this part so far. We're going to start with the very first thing that we talked about in the beginning, which is our quadrants, which should be review from geometry. So this is quadrant 1 up in the upper right, and then quadrant 2 is in the upper left. Quadrant 3 is below it, and then quadrant 4. Okay. We have also talked about the number of degrees. For instance, on our x-axis, we could be at 0 degrees if that's where our terminal ray is. Okay? If it rotates up here, it's 90 degrees. If it rotates over here, it's 180 degrees. Okay? And if it rotates down here, that's 270 degrees. And if it rotates back here, that's 360 degrees. Okay. We also talked about negative rotation. All right. And so if we start at 0 degrees again, but rotate down or clockwise, then this could also be negative 90 degrees, okay. Negative 180 degrees, negative 270 degrees, and then rotating back here could be also negative 360 degrees. Okay. All right. We have also talked a little bit about our unit circle, in that this circle here that they have drawn is centered at the origin and has a radius of 1 unit long. Okay. We also know the point up here, that any point is labeled x, comma, y. Okay. And the farthest that we go over is our x. Okay. And what we go up is our y. Okay. And that we have to realize we have theta in here, and that x is now also known as cosine theta, and that y is also known as sine theta. And so our x coordinate and our y coordinate can now be known as cosine theta, comma, sine theta. Okay, goes alphabetical just like x and y do in our alphabet. Cosine C goes before our sine. Okay. All right, so we're also going to go ahead and talk about coordinates of a point up in quadrant 1. And we have to realize that our coordinates in quadrant 1 are always a positive and a positive. Positive for x and positive for y. Okay. And so remember that cosine is our first coordinate, which is going to be positive, and that sine is our y coordinate, which is also positive. Okay. And also remember that tangent theta is equal to sine theta over cosine theta. And a positive over a positive equals a positive. And tangent theta will be positive. And so we come up with something that is all are positive. Okay? All trig functions are positive. Whereas when we visit quadrant 2, okay, in order to get to quadrant 2, we have to go in a negative direction and then a positive direction up. Okay? And so since the negative is first and cosine is first, cosine is negative. Sine is second and sine is positive. Okay? And that tangent theta is equal to your sine, which is positive, divided by your cosine, which is negative, and that's going to give you a negative. Okay? And so in the second quadrant, sine is the only trig function that's positive. Okay? Coming down into quadrant 3, you would have to get a negative direction followed by a negative direction to go down into quadrant 3. And so therefore sine and cosine are both negative. And tangent theta, which is known as sine theta, who is negative, divided by cosine theta, which is negative, actually equals a positive. And so in quadrant 3, since we talk about who is positive, tangent is positive. So we get T plus. Okay. Off to our last quadrant, that's quadrant 4. In order to get into quadrant 4, you have to go to the right, which is positive, and then down, which is negative. Okay. And since our positive is first and our cosine is first, cosine's positive and sine is second, which is negative. Okay. And again, tangent theta is equal to sine, which is negative, over cosine, which is positive, and a negative divided by a positive is a negative, and tangent is negative. And therefore, the only one that's positive this time is cosine is positive. And so we get our little saying that all students take calculus. All trig functions are positive. The sine trig function is the only one positive in quadrant 2. The tangent trig function is the only positive one in quadrant 3. And the cosine trig function is the only one that's positive in quadrant 4. Okay? And by knowing that, that'll help us place our angles. Okay? Oh, we're not finished yet. We have a little bit left to fill in. Okay? Remember that this is the unit circle, and so when the radius goes out 1 unit all the way to the left, this would reach the coordinates 1, 0. Okay? If the radius extends out to the left-hand side of our unit circle, that point on that unit circle would be -1, 0. Okay? If the radius extends up, okay, 1 unit, then we reach the point 0, 1. And if the radius extends down 1 unit, we reach the point down here on the unit circle of 0, -1. Okay? And that is a lot to take in, but that is what is necessary to understand the unit circle and the trigonometry that we do with it. All right. So I'm going to come down and scroll down a little bit so we can answer some questions based on our unit circle. So in number 3, it says to determine the exact value of the following using the unit circle diagram. So we want the cosine of 360 degrees. So we know at 360 degrees, we're at this point on the unit circle because they're asking me to use the unit circle diagram. Okay, so at 360, we're at this point. And because they want to know cosine, and cosine is the x coordinate, we would go ahead and say that cosine of 360 degrees equals 1. Okay. All right, sine of pi, and so this is in radians, okay? But if you remember that pi is the same thing as 180 degrees, we can think in degrees instead, okay? So sine of 180 degrees is over here on the x-axis, so we're at this point on the unit circle, and sine is the second coordinate, or the y-coordinate, and that is 0, okay? All right, part C. They're throwing them all at us. 630 degrees is well around once. So if we take 360 degrees away from 630, we realize that it's 360 plus 270. Okay, and so we're going to look at 270 degrees. Remember, we went around a whole time and then 270, so we're still stopping at 270. We are at this point on the unit circle, and since they're asking about cosine of 630, cosine is the x-coordinate, which is 0. Okay. All right, cosine of -180. So going to -180 degrees on our unit circle, we're at this point here. And since they're asking about cosine, which is the first coordinate, that's -1. Okay. All right, part E, they're asking about pi over 2. And so hopefully you guys remember that pi is 180. And 180 over 2 is really just 90 degrees. Okay, so that's sine of 90 degrees. So up here at 90 degrees, we are at the coordinates of 0, 1. Okay, and sine is the second one, and so that is a 1. Okay. All right, 3 pi. 3 pi, guys, remember, is basically 3 180s. Okay, so if you want to think about that, or you can think about 2 pi and 1 pi. 2 pi is 360 degrees, and pi is 180. So we went around a whole time and then 180. So if we look at 180 degrees, we're looking at that point still. And sine is the second coordinate, or the y-coordinate, which is 0. Okay. And then we have tangent of pi over 2. And hopefully you guys remember we just did part E. Remember, pi is 180, and 180 divided by 2 is really 90 degrees. So we're looking at tangent at 90. So we have to remember a couple things about tangent, is that tangent theta is known as sine theta divided by cosine theta. And so at 90 degrees, sine, which is the y-coordinate, is 1. And cosine, which is the x-coordinate, is 0. And 1 divided by 0 is undefined. Okay, and then the last one. Negative 3 pi over 2 is the same thing as negative 270 degrees. Okay. And at negative 270 degrees, we are down here on the unit circle. Okay. And that sine theta is our y-coordinate, which is negative 1, over cosine theta, which is our x-coordinate, which is 0, and we get undefined yet again. And we can check all of these in our graphing calculator. Okay. All right, let's go ahead, guys, and take a look at number 4. Last question says, as pi increases from from pi over 2 to pi radians, the value of sine of theta will do what? All right, so let's think. Pi over 2 is really 90 degrees, and pi is really 180 degrees. So on our unit circle, 90 degrees is up here, and 180 degrees is here. And at 90 degrees, your coordinates are 0, 1. And at 180 degrees, your coordinates are negative 1, 0. Okay. They're asking about sine, and sine is the second coordinate or the y-coordinate. And so we're going from a 1 to a 0. Okay. As we go from 90 to 180, we're going from a 1 to a 0. So it is 1 to 0 is definitely a decrease. And so we're going to pick choice 1. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. It's the only one that seems to make sense. It's the only one that has the 1 and the 0. And the 1 has to go first because they're going from 90 to 180. And so we're going from a 1 to a 0. So it's got to be 1. All right, guys. Hopefully that helps. And I'll see you guys on the next day of notes.